model builder over there.
Yes, he
What?
probably saw a lot of neat stuff.
He knows something, doesn't he? He knows a part of the story.
Probably.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Peter, why did we buy the F-35 if it's overweight, too draggy, can't turn, can't loiter, can't absorb ground fire, and can't perform the original mission of the A-10 as highlighted by Pierre Spray?
Yeah, the F-35 is a curious case, and we're marketing that as a plane that we not only will sell to our services, but also to our allies in foreign countries. And the fact that it's become so complex and expensive has been a real problem for everybody involved. And I've talked to people who work on the program. The model of the Marines are going to fly is already becoming initially operational. And the people I've talked to freely admit that, yeah, there are technical problems, but they're being overcome through flight testing. And, I don't know how much of the criticism we can really believe when, someone says, oh, well, I can beat an F-35 with a conventional F-16. I don't think we know the full story as far as what's involved in that and why, the plane performed the way it did. But it's still undergoing testing, and there's probably going to be a pretty steep learning curve before they finally iron it out.
Okay. Peter, how did Lockheed Martin upper management allow the F-35 program to eventually go $163 billion over budget and 7 years behind schedule as reported by 60 Minutes?
Again, I've never followed the whole political brouhaha behind the JSF and how the price got driven up. That was supposed to be a plane that was going to be produced in large numbers to replace the F-16. So again, it sounded really good on paper, like it was going to be a relatively low-cost system and that all the different customers could afford it. But something obviously went wrong.
Yeah. Peter, according to a report published in ECN on August 4th, 2014, the money spent on the F-35 program could buy every homeless person in America a $600,000 mansion. How can the defense planners at the acquisition office in the Pentagon and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base allow this level of cost overrun to happen?
Yeah, budget issues like that are well beyond my area of knowledge. I just don't know.
Okay. Peter, please discuss how the Phantom Works was originally a McDonnell Douglas organization and what other secret aircraft they may have been built and flown.
McDonnell Douglas set up a smaller shop within their main plant in St. Louis, which they called the Phantom Works. And they were essentially building on the concept that was pioneered by Lockheed with the Skunk Works, the idea that you take a small independent shop of experts who can do rapid prototyping of advanced aircraft and demonstrate stuff essentially at a lower cost, maybe with less overall supervision than you would with a production program. One of the most famous projects that came out of there was the Bird of Prey. It was a one-off demonstrator to show new manufacturing techniques with large-scale composites, to demonstrate new techniques of low observables in terms of anti-radar, visual stealth, anti-infrared. And it was only flyable enough to do the job. It flew at a very low rate of test over a span of a couple of years. They got the information, and then it was still in the black world for a while until those new manufacturing techniques and capabilities essentially became industry standards. And now the company was able to take credit for it. It was started by McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas got bought out by Boeing, and Boeing continued the practice. And so the Phantom Works today continues to produce these interesting little prototypes and demonstrators, like the X-45 was for a prototype for an unmanned combat air vehicle to prove that you could use an autonomous aircraft that could go in and strike targets by dropping bombs or firing missiles. They also developed the the Phantom Ray, which was going to be follow-on to X-45. It would have been the X-45C and would have been much closer to an operational UCAV type vehicle, but that program got canceled by the government, and the company continued to fund it as a demonstrator called Phantom Ray. And this was tested and proved a very capable vehicle, and so the company has broadened its portfolio on the kind of capabilities they offer to the government customer. Phantom Works also worked on Phantom I, which is another unmanned vehicle, this time meant as a demonstrator for a high-altitude, long-endurance reconnaissance aircraft fueled by liquid hydrogen. So that's a little scary to operate with because, obviously hydrogen is very flammable. But this was demonstrated using a one-off prototype, which looks like a giant egg with wings and a tail, and it takes off riding on a little cart that stays on the ground. The airplane lifts off and it leaves its landing gear behind, and when it touches down it deploys skids. So this is just they built the thing, they tested it, and proved a new capability. So the Phantom Works has a lot of interesting stuff, and these are just the things we've heard of. There's probably a lot of things going on that we have not heard of, things that are still in the black, which hopefully one day will be revealed. Okay.
Peter, why did Boeing's X-32 lose out over Lockheed's X-35 for the JSF program?
Yeah, I don't think there's any great mystery as to why Boeing's X-32 lost out to the X-35 in the JSF fly-off competition. Boeing and Lockheed Martin both produced these demonstrators, and they were given X designations as X planes, although really they should have been YF planes because they're essentially a developmental prototype for a fighter. But each one was based on the company's vision of what the Joint Strike Fighter should be in terms of low observables and weapon carrying capabilities and so on. Just looking at the two of them, I think that the Lockheed model, the X-35, inherently looked better. It looked like it was more aerodynamic and more capable, like it was likely to be a lighter weight airframe to start with. They say in aircraft design, if it looks good, it's going to fly good. And that certainly seemed like the case with this. The X-32, Boeing's entry, looked hideous. And it had certain characteristics that I personally thought would have been disadvantageous under certain circumstances. For instance, it had a very large single jet intake on the front of the aircraft to allow air into the engine. And every time I saw that, I could only think of nighttime aircraft carrier operations, because you've got guys working around the plane in close proximity, the engine's being run up, and there's a big giant intake large enough to suck in some poor guy if he gets too close. In fact, the maintenance guys used to call it the sailor inhaler. And there is precedent for that sort of thing happening. If you ever look, there's a video of a guy being sucked into the intake of an A6. Mercifully, the A6 has very small intakes, and so he got caught about halfway down and survived. But in the case of the X-32, it would have been probably fatal.
Wow, okay, that's the terminology they use, huh?
They called it the sailor inhaler.
Wow, that's crazy. Peter, can you think of any additional highly classified aircraft programs George Muellner may have worked on? He was Boeing's Senior Vice President for Air Force Systems.
Yeah, George Muellner has a long history involved with black programs. He was involved with the Red Hats flying the MiGs early on, and then eventually, after his Air Force career, he ended up in industry. I don't know of any specific programs he worked on, but because of his background and his security clearances, I'm sure he would have been ideally suited to be involved in more black programs.
Okay. Peter, the October 28th, 2002 issue of Aviation Week stated that another secret aircraft other than the Bird of Prey shared the same hangar with the company's X-32 at its Palmdale facility. Peter, do you have any idea what this other aircraft might be?
That I don't know. I've not heard anything about that.
Okay. Peter, on January 20th, 1994, John Andrews of the Testers Model Corporation wrote a letter to Pete Ames requesting photos of an aircraft called the A-17. Do you have any additional details of this aircraft?
I don't. Pete Ames was a security guy at the Pentagon who oversaw the security for a variety of special access programs. And John Andrews had heard some kind of rumor about a secret aircraft, maybe called the A-17, so he asked for information on that. Of course, he got nothing, and whether that means that there was no such program or it was simply a classified program that couldn't be revealed at the time, we just don't know.
So who would have been in charge of all black programs during the mid-1980s, early 1990s? Are we talking Barry Hennessy, or who would be the main person?
I'm not sure who had overall coverage of that. I mean, you had security offices, but all of these black projects acquisitions were done through the Secretary of the Air Force Office of Acquisitions, a special part of that specifically dedicated to special access projects, separate from the white world stuff. So you have Air Force Secretary for acquisitions, but within his office there's somebody specifically responsible for the black programs. And that's the office code for that is SAF AQL, whereas the overall office acquisitions is just AQ, but AQL is the black programs world.
Oh, okay. According to Detroit Free Press, February 8th, 1987, the Air Force black budget for fiscal year 1988 was $19.1 billion. How many members of Congress have a need to know regarding black programs?
Now, I have to believe that the numbers of congressmen who are accessed into black programs is probably pretty small. There is some oversight, but critics argue that there's not enough oversight and that an awful lot of money is going into black programs and the taxpayer doesn't know that they're getting any value for that. And I mean, we've seen instances like the A-12 Avenger 2 where you have $5 billion and essentially no return. So when you have $18 billion going into a black hole for special access programs, where's it going? What are we getting for that? Is there hardware being built? Is it just studies? Are there operational planes going to places like Tonopah Test Range that we don't know about? It would be nice if they at least release something, every few years, maybe, just throw us a bone here.
Right. The June 10th, 1991 issue of Aviation Week indicated that a triangular aircraft known as the Manta Ray might have assisted the F-117 during Operation Desert Storm as a digital real-time reconnaissance aircraft or bomb damage assessment platform. Peter, does this aircraft actually exist, and who is the prime contractor?
There's a persistent rumor that there was some companion aircraft that flew on missions along with the F-117A during Operation Desert Storm. And I know people who just swear up and down that there's got to be this plane. And some of them say, oh yeah, they were built right alongside, there was a whole other thing in the factory, another production line where they were building these companion aircraft. But I'm very skeptical about this. And the reasons for this are twofold. One is that everything I've seen in terms of the concept of operations for the F-117A supports that it is a single ship operation, that it does not require the addition of another companion aircraft to perform its mission. And the people I've talked to who have flown it operationally and in test have stood up with that as well. None of the documentation on the program supports any need or use of a companion aircraft. But that's just part of the story. The other thing is, if there was another entire production line, remember they built, there were more than 60 F-117s altogether, 5 test aircraft, and then the 59 production aircraft. Well, if you had companion aircraft, they should have been produced in similar quantities. Even if you had half the number, that would be significant. And there should be some evidence of that production. With the F-117, we had a lot of good solid sightings, photographs. There were accurate descriptions of the numbers of the aircraft produced and where they were flown. We have nothing like that for the companion aircraft. Mm-hmm. With the F-117, the entire fleet went through depot maintenance. It was a periodic thing, it was regular. And then there were occasional upgrades and things like that. And when you're building and maintaining and modifying a fleet of aircraft, this produces a large quantity of waste, by which I mean hardware that gets removed from the airframes, parts that are built and rejected because of some flaw, pieces that are damaged during operations are removed, and parts that are taken off when they've been replaced with new ones and modified. So you have a lot of stuff that goes to the junkyard, and vast quantities of material from F-117, B-2, U-2, even YF-22, YF-23, Joint Strike Fighter, X-35, X-32, stuff like that would turn up in government surplus sales. Even the Avenger 2, when that didn't even go into full production. But there's no mystery parts. There's no bunch of parts from something that we haven't identified that has the inspection stamps from the manufacturer and the part numbers and the things that we would be able to say, okay, well, this is not from an F-117, but hey, it was built by Lockheed in the same time frame. There's nothing like that. So where's the evidence? With the 117, there was a lot of evidence of this thing existing. And I mean, not just sightings or rumors, but physical evidence. And there isn't anything for a companion. So I'm personally skeptical that such an aircraft exists. And some people disagree fervently. And I just don't know.
Okay, well, that's good. Peter, if this was a real aircraft, what would be the basic dimensions of it, and how many might have been built?
Yeah, I'm suspecting that there was no such thing. If you were going to build a companion aircraft, if the concept of operations for the F-117 required use of a companion, I would think you would have to have a comparable number of airframes to go with your fleet. Mm-hmm. Because it's, if you need it to support the mission, and you can expect that there's going to be downtime due to maintenance, attrition due to crashes and things like that, you're going to want to have enough airframes. But I just haven't seen any evidence that such a thing exists. And you look at the flight manual for the F-117A, and that's pretty straightforward in following the single ship mission operation concept.
Okay. What was the covert survivable in-weather reconnaissance strike program, and were any flying prototypes built and flown as a result of it?
In the early days of rumors about a stealth fighter, and we're talking now 1979 to mid-80s, not a lot was known about Lockheed's stealth fighter. Mm-hmm. President Carter had admitted that such a program was under development. There were leaks from people. There was a guy who brought home design drawings to show his girlfriend. I mean, he got arrested by the FBI because she turned him in. But there were leaks getting out. And one of the things that was unknown was what it was called. And I remember reading in a magazine a designation, CSEERS, Covert Survivable In-Weather Reconnaissance System. But I've never found anything in terms of official documentation or anyone who worked on the early days of the stealth who has used that terminology, so I'm not sure where that came from. There was an assumption at the time that the airplane had a designation, a fighter-type designation, because it was called a stealth fighter. And that turned out to be true, although not what people thought. observers who followed that sort of thing were looking, and they said, okay, well, we've got the F-15, F-16, the F-17 was a prototype, the F-18 was a production version, and then all of a sudden we've got Northrop's F-20, so there's a missing number, F-19. And so the assumption was, oh, well, the missing number must be for this stealth fighter, it's called the F-19, which was not the case. As it turned out, Northrop was trying to market a new airplane. It was an upgraded version of their F-5. They called it the F-5G, and it was designed and funded by the company with the idea of selling it to either the U.S. or foreign countries that were allies. But someone said, you know, the term F-5G is a marketing nightmare because it makes it sound like it's just another F-5. The F-5 production started like in 1959-60, so you don't want to try to sell people a new airplane that sounds like an old airplane. And it was a really significant improvement over the original F-5, so it was a new airplane. So they said, we want to give it a new modern number, make it sound modern. So of course the Air Force said, oh, no problem, it's the F-19. And Northrop said, we don't like that because we want a round number, you know, marketing, you know, we want this to sound really fresh, and so let's call it the F-20. And the Air Force shrugged and said, okay, call it the F-20. And so there is no F-19.
Mm-hmm.
The way they hand out these designations, it's all done through an office in Battle Creek, Michigan. And the system was originally designed in 1962. It's called Mission Design Series, MDS, MDS designations. And this was because back before '62, the Navy and the Air Force and everybody had their own systems for designating an aircraft. And the Navy loved their system. It was very descriptive. If you knew how to follow it, it sounded like gobbledygook. You'd have a plane called, say, the F-4H-1, Phantom II. And then the Air Force had the same airplane, and they called it the F-4A. Well, why is it different? Well, the Navy system, it told you where, what kind of plane it was, where it fit in, and who was building it. But the Defense Department said, we need to just unify this. So we came up with MDS. Everybody's going to use the same system. And by that point, they'd gotten up to F-111. And the Air Force was ready to call one of their planes the F-110A Spectre. This ended up under the new system as the F-4C Phantom II. And so, every airplane following, you have F-4, F-5, and so on. And it made perfect sense. But with F-20, you started abusing the system, and that abuse has only gotten worse over the years. And so now you have airplanes that should be YF for a pre-production prototype for a fighter being given X designations, like X-32 and X-35. And when they selected one to be produced as the JSF, it probably should have been called the F-25. But it was called the F-35 because the prototype was the X-35 and they just changed the X to an F. So now you've got a big gap in the numbers. And the F-16s, which you started out F-16A, F-16B, F-16C, and so on,